name is Sinu Sitaraman, and I'm one of the event organizers and volunteers. We are privileged to have with us today two outstanding authors, Ms. Naheed Phiroze Patel and Mr. Raza Mir, engaged in a conversation about their works with Ms. Sindya Bhanoo. Regarding the two works, Naheed's book, if I may use your first name, is a work of fiction titled Mirror Made of Rain and is published by the firm The Unnamed Press. The book is a personal, empathetic view of mothers whom society has deemed quote-unquote failures. It provides a riveting exploration of class and tradition in contemporary India. Raza's book, Murder at the Mushaira, also a work of fiction, is published by the Aleph Book Company. The book is set against the backdrop of India's 1857 uprising and is a brilliantly constructed murder mystery. To recap our two authors' bios as described in the program guide, Naheed is a graduate of the MFA program at Columbia University School of Arts. Her writing has appeared in New England Review, The Guardian, Huffington Post, PEN America, and other renowned publications. Raza grew up in Hyderabad and teaches management at William Patterson University. His previous works include Ghalib, A Thousand Desires. I believe that's your latest book. The Taste of Words, an introduction to Urdu poetry, and Anthems of Resistance, a celebration of progressive Urdu poetry with co-author Ali Hussain Mir. We look forward to an enlightening book conversation with Ms. Sindya Bhanoo, a fiction writer herself. Sindya has published a story collection, Seeking Fortune Elsewhere, and her fiction has appeared in Granta, New England Review, and other prestigious publications. Cynthia is a graduate of University of California, Berkeley School of Journalism and Carnegie Mellon University. She teaches at Oregon State University. And with that introduction, over to you, Cynthia, and our two authors.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's such an amazing festival and so wonderful to hear about all these different stories that our writers have written. I wanted to just start by saying that I come to fiction from journalism, and Barka Dutt spoke so beautifully about journalism being the first draft of history. But so often there are some stories that are absent from that first draft. They never get told. And fiction offers us a chance to go back and correct that just a little bit. We can't completely correct it, but the stories of women, of immigrants, of those from marginalized communities, those stories are often absent from the archive. And when they are absent, everybody loses, those who are from those communities and those who aren't. And Namrata spoke about how we need more and more representation. We do, it accumulates, and the stories are layered and nuanced, and one book allows the next book to be written. And today we have these two beautiful books by Naheed and Raza. They're very different novels set in very different time periods in India. Naheed's novel is set in contemporary India, and Raza's novel takes us back to the 1850s. So I want to just start by having each of them kind of set the time and place and tell us where these stories take place and who the main protagonist is. And maybe we'll go chronologically. So Raza, if you could tell us, I was born and raised in the United States. This book takes place in the 1850s in India during a major rebellion, which some of you might know about, but I didn't. But even those who know could use a reminder.
Sure, Sindhya. First of all, thank you very much, all of you, for being here. There are some familiar faces, and I really am honored to be here and to share the stage with Sindhya and Naheed. And I have read both their books, and I cannot recommend them highly enough. My book, Murder at the Mushaira, is set in 1857. The revolt of 1857, which Indians refer to as the first war of Indian independence, happened it began on the 11th of May, when soldiers from the barracks of an adjacent town in India, from Delhi, Meerut, overpowered their bosses, rode to Delhi, and took over the city. And it was an extraordinarily brazen and courageous act, and it inaugurated this rebellion that then held the entire world in its thrall for about 4 or 5 months. And so my book is set at the cusp of this revolution, and it really fictionalizes the events leading up to it and turns it into a bit of a whodunit involving a murder. The protagonist of the book is Mirza Ghalib. Those of you who are familiar with Indian history and Indian literature know that Ghalib is the foremost Urdu poet of his time and of all time, and possibly one of the foremost poets ever. At least that is my contention. And part of the conceit of the book is that I turn Ghalib into a detective, that a murder has taken place and Ghalib is trying to solve the crime, and the identity of the killer and the motive of the murder is inextricably linked with the 1857 rebellion, and its success hinges on certain events leading to that. So that is, in a nutshell, the framework in which this book is written. Thank you, Sindhya.
Yeah, and if you heard Raza's bio, he's a professor. He teaches in the business school, and so he writes his fiction after 5 p.m. So it's not so surprising that he's got a poet who's moonlighting as a detective. But we can maybe ask him about that later. Naheed, why don't you tell us more about your setting and your protagonist, Numi?
Yeah, it's hard to follow such an exciting premise as Raza's book, but my book is, it's set in contemporary India, and it follows the life of a young woman who is, lives in a very small, conservative, small town in India. And it really kind of explores themes of women's anger and the ways that we're sort of, as a society, we're kind of encouraged to look at ourselves through the eyes of others and value our self-worth. So therefore, like the whole play on mirrors and the idea that, we are always looking into a mirror, which is actually our fellow, our friends, our family, society in general, for approval, for validation, and how to honestly kind of break out of that or break through that.
And we'll talk about Raza's research process in a moment, but your research for this book, you would have had to kind of create this world where women through generations are kind of experiencing, there's alcoholism, there's mental illness, there are many stigmas that surround this. It's not something that people talk about a lot in Indian society. These women that Numi writes about are in an upper middle class community in a small town in India. So how did you investigate these issues and then sort of kind of come to write about them through Numi's voice?
Well, it's not a terribly plot-driven book. So in this book, I had the privilege of going where the voice took me. And most of this book was drafted during my MFA program. And, in an MFA program, you kind of draft small chunks of writing. And it was very much led by what people found interesting, what people wanted to kind of hear more about, which characters. I think the voice kind of developed organically. I actually wrote the whole thing in close third first, and then I redrafted in first. And when I rewrote it in first, I mean, this is one of like maybe 25 drafts, but like it just felt like I was closer to achieving what I wanted to with this book. So yeah, I can't really pinpoint a process or something. It was kind of just, feeling around in a dark room.
Yeah, yeah. And Raza, what about your process? I feel that it would have taken like a decade of research.
First of all, I must say 25 drafts has me very intimidated.
I'm a very bad writer.
Oh, and moving from third person to first person, it's extraordinary what kind of drafting process that goes through these books. I'm sure every writer has their own stories. As far as I'm concerned, I entered the realm of my story through poetry. So I am interested in Urdu poetry, and I became very interested in the works of Mirza Ghalib. And Ghalib's poetry is very philosophical, it is very abstruse, it is very difficult to pin down. But during the course of reading about him, I realized two things. One is that Ghalib also wrote a lot of prose. And just to come to that, I'll take the second point. Ghalib is also a very modern figure. So he is born in Mughal India, and he dies in colonial India. And the moment of the inauguration of the colonial India is this 1857 rebellion, following which the British Crown takes over India from the East India Company. But the point is that Ghalib is also encountering a lot of modernity. And one of the modern things that he encountered was the Indian postal system. And he began to write a lot of letters to his friends, and his letters were collected and published. And it is one of the first examples of modern Urdu prose. So in the course of reading that, I felt that I had a handle on this man. And I also felt that I began to know him, because his corpus is quite varied. And then the idea came to make him the protagonist of a novel. And then the thing suggested itself. And like you said, Sindhya, the process was very long. And I began to read very dry, historical tracts and, familiarize myself with the milieu. And then, cast it into something that was completely fictional and hopefully entertaining. So that took its own time, yeah.
Yeah, but that last thing that you talk about is very difficult to do when you have so much historical material. I think in order for fiction to succeed, whatever kind of facts we start with, the fictional story has to rise above that. It has its own truth to it, and this poet is a detective in your story. There are real characters. They're Britishers who are real, but also Britishers whom you've made up. So how did you avoid getting trapped in sort of the facts?
So first of all, you have to relentlessly scrub out exposition, right? You can't just start saying stuff that, this has happened and that is the context. So you have to place it into the lived experience of one of the characters, which is why my book has far too many characters. At some point in time, people might say, you don't really need that many characters, but each one of them is used to provide context, to provide narrative. I also wanted, because the revolt ostensibly was by the military. It was a military rebellion. In fact, the British called it the Sepoy Mutiny. But also the nobility, which is the Rajas and the Nawabs, got involved. But more importantly, the peasantry also, aam log, who were being affected by British colonialism and its dangerously efficient taxation regime. So it is very important to have characters that inhabit everything, right? You have some noble folk, you have some common folk, and you have some military folk, and you also need to have British. Otherwise, your antagonists become very two-dimensional, and you don't really want to pull British characters out of central casting, as it were. So you do all these things together, and hopefully, at some point in time, you say, oh, this is getting boring, and then you push it. I really don't know how it happens, but in the end, it's a hot dog, who knows how it was made? The more important thing is whether it tastes good.
Yeah.
So I hope it does.
I want to come back to the topic of women who figure in a very central way in Numi's book. This book, I don't think it says what year it takes place in, but it's now, right? It takes place now in India. And both Numi and her mother are trying to break free from this trap that society has kind of stuck them into, these traditional roles that they feel trapped in. They're so modern, they speak and act and dress in a modern way. And I felt kind of angry on their behalf during many moments, but I know the society they live in and the challenges they face. And these two books are so different, but what is heartbreaking is that there are certain things that have not changed for women in India from 1857 to 2022. So I want to come to Raza in a moment, but I want you to talk about that these women have so much, they're well educated, they're affluent, and yet they are judged in every moment of her life. She is judged, Numi. So could you talk about that and her mom as well?
Yeah, I think Numi, like you said, she tries really hard to break free of that kind of hall of mirrors of being constantly scrutinized and judged. But I think because she's not very self-aware and very self-reflexive, she doesn't really succeed, or she doesn't do it really well. I hear all the time that she's very unlikable. And I think that her unlikability to me was the only kind of agency that she had, where she could go, well, I'm not going to be nice. I'm not going to be nice about what oppresses me, and I'm going to be annoying, or I'm going to not go along, just smile and go along with what's happening. So yeah, and I think that with her mother too, I think that I wasn't trying to indict patriarchy, or I just or like press my hand on the scale for any one particular character. I just kind of wanted to show the world as it is, as this is what happens and this is how it is, and these are the small microaggressions that, women face not only in our time, but during 1857, and not only in India, but pretty much all over the world. So yeah.
Yeah, these are small slights, comments on weight, on your looks, on the way you're dressed, on where you're supposed to sit and how you sit. And those little things pop up in your book as well. In spite of that, though, I think that there are women acting in very brave ways. They're doing brave things, and they're exercising power when they can. And I wonder if you could talk about a few of those women in your book. One who figures very centrally, Haidari, is that her name? Yeah, could you tell us a bit?
So Haidari is a character that I created, and she's first of all a Muslim woman who's married to a Hindu, Mohanlal Zuchi. Actually, Mohanlal Zuchi, also known as Mohanlal Kashmiri, is a historical character who inhabited India in the 1857, although I have taken liberties with it. When I was reading this man's history, I just found a passing sentence in his biography that said his wife's name was Haidari. And it struck me that the person who was writing it did not find it particularly remarkable to develop this point further. So it gives you to understand that interreligious relationships at that time were a little more perhaps chill than even in the 21st century. Now, I began to develop this character because I feel that a rebellion of this sort was not entirely led by men. The women have played a very significant role And unfortunately, the way historiography is practiced, their role has been effaced out. So that's what, I mean, to go back to the point that Sindhya made first, that in the first and subsequent drafts of history, women have been written out. So it is up to us fiction writers to write them back in. So I made her embody all those, characteristics that we find very likable, like courage, the ability to stand up to, for want of a better word, patriarchal society. But really, she's standing up to men, and she is actively taking part in this movement, and she has a sense of what it means from a historical standpoint. And I'm really proud of that Heathery character, because I think she came out pretty well.
Yeah, I am too. You'll have to read the book to find out what she does. One relationship I found fascinating was Ghalib's relationship with a Hindu scientist named Master Ramachandra, who is also, I believe, a real life character. And he's sort of like an assistant. But he's fascinating, and it's fascinating that they have this kind of friendly banter. Could you talk about that?
It's a bit of a Holmes-Watson relationship,
Yes.
isn't it? Ghalib is a poet. Ghalib is a romantic. Ghalib is a philosopher. Ramachandra is a scientist. Ramachandra is a rationalist. And Ramachandra is also a young man. So I found that a buddy cop dynamic could emerge from it. Ramachandra Mathur, Rai Ramchandra Mathur, is a fascinating character who was in India in the 19th century, who was a professor at Delhi College and did an extraordinary amount of scientific experiments, and there is ample evidence to suggest, but there is no information to the effect that he may have met Ghalib, because Ghalib had some relationship with the Delhi College. So these are the liberties that novelists can take, right? There's a character here and there's a character there. Come on, let's make them friends, and let's make them talk to each other, and let's make them argue with each other. And because Ramachandra is a scientist, then I can bring in some forensic science and then use a CSI type of metaphor, which is used to solve the crime. So, yeah.
Yeah. I also should say that there are extramarital relationships in both books that has stood the test of time from 1857 to 2022. But in Numi's life, there's a string of men, and they all kind of play a different role. And you start us off with the kind of difficult, not difficult, but a sort of strange memory of her and her cousin at an event towards the beginning of the book. Adil, is that his name?
Adil, yeah.
Yeah, but then it goes on to kind of her first boyfriend, who's a much older person, the brother of her friend, and then a boyfriend who breaks up with her because he finds out about that prior relationship, and she finally meets the man she marries. But can you talk about the roles those different men play in her life?
I think that the key role in Numi's life is her relationship with her father. Mm-hmm. And her father, even though her father loves her and is, he validates her in a way that none of these other men can, in the sense that he truly loves her for who she is. And I think she tries desperately to replicate that relationship, that camaraderie that she has with her father, with other men, but she always finds that she can't find a relationship where she's just seen for who she is, and rather it's always like, again, not to harp on the mirror metaphor too much, but like it's always what she's always reflected back in these men. And she doesn't really like what she sees most of the time. I think with the man that she ends up with is the closest that she comes to having and this is again like I said, Numi is not she's very insecure. She's very not self-reflective. She's not done the homework to really be able to sustain a relationship. but I think the closest that she comes to actually having a reflection that she can live with is with the person that she ends up with.
Yeah, and as the story progresses, we feel, and she also, I think, feels that her life may become her mother's, and there's this sort of anxiousness that we start to
Well,
feel.
there's this line that I really, yes, there is that anxiousness. I think that anxiousness is kind of a through line throughout the book. And, you know, when I was writing the book in one of the reasons why I took 25 drafts is because it was an exploratory journey, and I really didn't know what I wanted to say and what's going to happen. I mean, I definitely don't recommend writing a book that way. It's much better to have an outline. But I think that, you know, during this drafting period, I think my editor in India, he kind of he spotted that metaphor of mirrors before I did, and he's like, you know, there's something there, let's heighten that, because it kind of also underlines or underscores her fear of turning into her mother. And there's a line towards in the last chapter of the book where you say that your mother is your first mirror. It's the first time you see yourself is through a parent's eyes. But what if that parent is incapable of giving you what you need? Or what if that mirror is shattered, basically? What self-image do you come up with? You know? And how do you fix that?
Yeah, and is there a way out? And
you
I
have to
think
read-
we have
you
to read the
to
book
find
for
out.
new me. Well, let's see. I would love to also maybe hear about what publishing has been like for both of you, and maybe what your writing inspirations have been. What was the publishing process like for you for this book?
It was quite a harmonious process. I mean, I think it helps that I do not, like you mentioned, I do not do this for a career. I was introduced to this publisher of Aleph book company by a friend of mine, and it helped that I did not know much about the process. So there is the CEO of the company, his name is David Davidar, fairly well-known editor. And I sat down and wrote about a third of the book, and I basically sent it to him and said, don't mind, can you give me some advice? So he said, book is good, I'll give you contract. So it was not a particularly onerous process. I do not have an agent, and I told him, would you please, I know that you are a CEO type, and so you're busy with other things, but would you actually edit this book for me? And he worked pretty hard with it. My experience in editing was good, in the sense that they would simply read it, and they would say, they would point out a lot of gaps in the narrative and say, why don't you build this here, and why don't you explain that more, and so on and so forth. And, you take a little, and then you push back a little also. There is this, there is a particular orthodoxy in writing fiction, which is show, don't tell, right? You can't say, apparently, she got angry. You should say her face became red or something like that. I pushed back. I said, no, I like to tell. I mean, show, don't tell is all bullshit. I will do what I like. And, they kind of relented a little bit. And there is something to be said about don't use adjectives. Anything with the ly in it is not adverbs. I'm so sorry. So he shouted angrily. Huh? No, angrily, no. But I managed to shoehorn my favorite adverbs throughout. So, it was all right. It really, I'm pleasantly surprised by the fact that the book is quite successful, but, it's still amateur hour, frankly. This is not super polished work.
Oh, no, it is. And how about for you? How was the publishing process for you?
So I also struggled against well, in my case, I struggle against plot orthodoxies about like how there should be like a central conflict that's kind of like the engine that drives a book, when the books that attracted me most were not like machines or engines with this central conflict driving the plot forward. They were more books that were like trees that just, kept having these fractal divisions that just went on and on. Books like The God of Small Things, and like Burnt Sugar, like A Ghost in the Throat by Doreen Nigrifa. And so it was really hard for me. It was easier to be published in India because I felt like there was more space for me to have an alternative to the conflict-driven plot. And my editor over there really encouraged, and every book is such a risk. It's such a, every time you write a book and send it out into the world, you're really you just don't know what's going to happen. And so I'm really grateful to like both my editors in India and in the US that they took like a risk on a book like mine. And they gave it everything. And with my editor in India, I went through several drafts, and we were both not satisfied until we were satisfied. So it was a really wonderful, syncretic, really great experience to work. And I feel very fortunate in that I got that opportunity and chance to do that with a book like this, which is such an unwieldy little book,
Yeah, you talk, and it's interesting that you were published in India and in the United States, and you're talking about mirrors so much, and maybe this book, do you think, means something different to the reader in India who picks it up, and different to a reader here? Has the response been different in any way?
Well, the thing about the book, when the book came, the book came out in India in May 2021. Possibly the worst time in history for a book to be out, because we were at the height of, we couldn't, I was talking to my publicist and she's like, well, I would like to speak to so-and-so reviewer, but she's in the hospital with her mom, and so-and-so editor, it was just the world had shut down.
Yeah.
And it was just, but even then, I mean, I was again, like, I had shut down as well. I was more interested in what was happening because I have family in India. But even then, there were people reading and there were people responding to the book, and I felt incredibly moved and incredibly like, it was just the best feeling that even though there was so much going on, that readers were still reading.
Yeah.
And I think that was, I obviously I never want to have that experience again, but and when the book came out here, things were much easier, and the world had opened up a bit more. And again, like, I felt like this book is not the kind of book that's going to appeal to like a broad swath of society, but I really appreciate and love when a reader writes to me or responds to me and says, this is what I liked about your book, this is what, and that's, that's what keeps me going in terms of being able to write the next book.
Yeah, and you'd mentioned that it came out in 2021 at the height of the pandemic when things were very difficult in India, and it's hard as a writer to have a book come out during that time.
It's hard in any time.
It's hard, but yeah, having a book out is hard. It's just a difficult thing to publish a book, and there is that moment when it comes out when people pick up your book and read it, but then there's the other thing which I said, which it's added to the archive and it exists for all of time. Someone can pick this up in 50 years and they get a snapshot of life as you have seen it and written about it. And that is perhaps more valuable in the end, and sort of the purpose behind what we're doing, that the story just is there, and when someone needs it, they can reach out and pick it up. I have just a couple more questions for each of you, and then I'd like to see what questions the audience has. I hope you have questions. First, Numi, I think I'll ask you this question. Sorry. Your book is on my mind.
You can call it Mirza instead of Raza.
You gave her an N name.
I I did. Well, no,
With
it's just
two syllables.
I was like, okay, so first I wanted to name her, like, I had a whole bunch of names, and I was like, something that's accessible, something that kind of captures the spirit of the character, and so, like, you know, and also she's Parsi, so it has to be like a Parsi name, so I was like, oh, and that's what I came up with, so.
Yeah, yeah, and also lovely that that you wrote a story about that's set in the Parsi community. So many of us know so little about the community,
I
and
know
it's
so
just.
little about the community. I'm still figuring things out.
But I want to ask you about mental illness. So alcoholism is spoken of, although it's still kind of like there's kind of some secrets kept around it. Like let's not say it openly, but also is there a thread of mental illness running through the women in the family? Do you think, or no? It wasn't spoken of as explicitly.
Well, I think it's more about how you're reacting to the confines, the constraints of a society in which you can't authentically be yourself, and how that could possibly manifest in mental illness or in, you know, alcoholism, or just, I look at it more as like self-medicating, really. And I think that what interests me is that, you know, things are always getting better, but like mental health and mental health advocacy has always been a huge thing that I'm interested in. And the resources are getting better, but there's still a huge stigma to reach out and talk about your mental health. And especially it's better, and you know, if you have the anonymity of a big city, like if you're in Delhi or Bombay or someplace, it's possibly easier because everybody doesn't have to know what you're going through. But in a small town, necessarily everybody knows what everybody, you know, it's like the small town in To Kill a Mockingbird. Like, you know what's happening in your neighbor's house, in your friend's house. So I think I don't think you can boil it down to this element and that element. I think it's a composite system that really creates, you know, that kind of drives forward what happens in the book.
And what is the name of the town where the story starts?
Kamalpur.
Kamalpur, which is a fictional town.
It is a fictional town.
And the book later takes us to Delhi and Bombay,
Yeah.
but it starts here in this small town, which is very interesting to see how this small world functions, how high society and this small town functions.
So the reason why it's called Kamalpur is a bit of a long story, but one of the possible titles for the novel was The Lotus Eaters. And that was based on, you know, the mythical lotus eaters of, I think it's in the Odyssey, that they eat lotus flowers and then they forget about their troubles and they don't care about what's happening. And I was like trying to, like, this is a town full of lotus eaters, that they're just like in their little town and they don't really care about the outside world because they have this soporific society that they're kind of enmeshed in. And that's why, you know, Kamal Lotus. So that's why. But then we went down a different path, but the name remained.
Yeah. And Raza, I wanted to see if you might talk about how the artists in your book survive, how poets make a living in the 1850s, how they rely on these wealthy patrons. I thought that was so interesting, how that was, you know, we see it all through the book, and they're not wealthy. Our protagonist, who's brilliant, is not a wealthy man, but I thought this might have been something you researched.
Yes, so there are all manners of artists that populate the book. There are, of course, the Urdu poets, the principal one of whom is Mirza Ghalib, and there are the Kathak dancers, who is Ratna, and a bunch of people who also are involved in the rebellion. And Haidari herself is an artist, so she is drawing miniatures. So it appears, this is very interesting, that the Mughal court, for example, was a place, the British had de facto administrative control of Delhi at that time. And what they essentially had was a figurehead Mughal emperor who got a stipend and who was expected to keep up appearances. So this particular emperor and several people in Awadh and Jhansi and Gwalior and other places were supporters of the arts. And not just the kings, but the lower noblemen and so on and so forth. They would offer stipends, they would support artists. And so being an artist, while it was a precarious existence, it provided a living wage. And 1857, by the way, destroyed that entire ecosystem. So since it is prior to that, we see all of them getting by, but at the same time expressing themselves through their art in multiple ways and multiple forums.
Yeah, it's fascinating to read about. And I'm about to open it up to questions, but Raza, I wonder, when we conclude, if you could give us a line of Ghalib's poetry, or maybe your favorite one, or something meaningful to you, that it would be beautiful to hear it. But I'd like to first, yes.
Okay, I haven't read your book, Raza, but I'm quite fascinated. Thank you. I'm quite fascinated by the plot that you've described. Mirza Ghalib turning forensic scientist, doing a CSI. But I just have one question specifically to the character of Ghalib in your story. Typically, a person like Mirza Ghalib, who is a poet and a philosopher and a very creative person, would find it hard to be analytical, which is something a detective has to be. So how have you reconciled these rather polar opposites in character that you bring into the book?
Yeah. The simple fact of the matter is, the way the plot proceeds in the book is that the policeman who is given the case, a guy named Kirodimal Chensuk, his uncle is one of Ghalib's creditors. And when he's asked to sort these things out, the milieu of poetry is very unfamiliar to him. So he just plucks this guy out of thin air and says, "You are the detective." So Ghalib is hardly analytical. He's kind of blundering his way along, which is why he kind of ropes in the scientist. That is the way it goes on. But you are absolutely right. There are ways of thinking, and there are different ways of thinking, and they kind of intersect and converse with each other in the name of solving a mystery. So yeah, it's there.
Thank you. My question is for Professor Mir. Something similar to what Mr. Bucklow said. Besides being incredibly observant of the surroundings, detectives and poets, what essential skills do you think they both share, the professions, poets and detectives? And one more quick thing. Do you have any information whether the historical Ghalib had any exposure to Edgar Allan Poe's writings?
Has any?
Edgar Allan Poe, his mysteries, whether he was exposed to them?
You know, I think so. I really think that at that time, Delhi was an incredibly cosmopolitan place. The plays of Shakespeare were being performed there, and so the milieu was there. And so I would imagine that Poe had also traveled there through some form or the other. And, you know, other than being, I mean, really, one of the things about poetry is that what is on the first viewing is not, and you really have to excavate. And that is the skill that the poet brings to bear in the solving of the narrative, in the solving of the mystery. You will be the judge of whether I was able to achieve that. But yeah, I mean, you know, one has to be very, should I say, faithful to the period. So whatever was available there and whatever could be deployed was the only things that I used. What poisons, what so on and so on.
Yes.
So just going back to that point, I want to corroborate what Raza is saying. Ghalib's poetry is very deep. So to write to that level and to understand that he's thinking that deep, he has to be analytical. You can't write like that unless you're very highly intelligent. I mean, they say that the year Ghalib died was the year Gandhi was born, and that's sort of brings the country's history together. My question is very simple. Would you like to create a series out of this? Murdered, Mushaira, murdered, this, murdered.
So
we would love to hear more, read more.
believe it or not, there is a demand for this genre apparently. So I've been under pressure because in this book, not to provide a spoiler, but Ghalib dies at the end of this book. We all know he's a historical figure, people die. So we can't bring him back to life. So it's a prequel. A prequel is in the works. Apparently it is awaited. And all I have to do now is to write the damn thing. Dekho, pata nahi kab hoga.
It was a pleasure learning about both your books. Thank you. Naheed, my question is to you. You said it was easier to get published in India than here in some ways. So were you writing to a specific audience when you were writing? Were you thinking of an Indian audience versus a diaspora audience? Is that something you thought about?
I think I was writing towards women like me, you know, who've had the opportunity of an education and some level of privilege, but also have seen the constraints and constrictions of living in a more conservative society. And I don't think that you know, I think that the book kind of transgresses borders in that sense, because I've had a lot of people, like, just through messages and DMs say that, well, I completely identified with this, and not just women, but young men. So I really didn't have a, you know, like a set audience in mind, but I do see that it appeals to like younger people who are kind of exploring their own identities and own ideas of what it means to exist as a person in this world. And I think that the reason why the book sold faster in India is because it's based in India. It's an Indian story. There was more connection in that sense. So yeah.
So my question is to either of you or both of you about whether you have a writing community and the role that plays as you develop the work.
Whatever I write, I show to this guy.
Oh.
And
this is
that's
Raza's brother.
my writing community. So it's helpful to have one reader. It's helpful to have, I think, one reader who gives you feedback. And so it's worked well for me.
I found that, you know, the MFA program, one of the advantages of going to an MFA program is that it's an opportunity to find community. But I actually found that once I graduated and I was a couple of years kind of distance from the program, I started finding people I connected with. But it's an ongoing process, and I think the more you do events like this, or the more you put yourself out there and, you know, actively seek community, the easier it is to find. And the more you write, just every time I've done one of these things, or I have, you know, written an essay, or there's somebody who's responded, or somebody who's written back, and sometimes I made a new friend and a new reader, and so it's a very, like, you know, organic process.
I will also add, if there are any writers in the room, that it's important to have writers from all walks of life, not just writers coming to it from a background in literature, not just writers coming from MFA programs. We want the landscape to be rich and textured, and what makes writing beautiful and stories beautiful is when the writer shares their unique observations of the world. So it is important to have a writing community. It's not important to have a formal writing community or a formal degree. We're nearly out of time, but I would love to end with a little poetry.
Oh, sure.
One or two lines.
Just 2 lines.
Yeah.
कि हैं और भी दुनिया में सुखनवर बहुत अच्छे, हैं और भी दुनिया में सुखनवर बहुत अच्छे, कहते हैं कि गालिब का है अंदाज़े बयां और.
Thank you. Do you have the translation?
There are many poets who ply their wares, but they say that Mr. Ghalib is something entirely else.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you all so much. You should buy their books. Thank you for being a part of the conversation.